Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon is the first train for love. There's lots of love in this game, with the romance novelist and the tragic breakup between Tino and Laurie. Let's start with the most fun character, Nancy Drew. Who should Nancy date in this game? Well, it's gotta be one of the Hardy Boys. She would not be good with Tino Balducci because he's too much of a jerk to her. She would be okay with John Gray. The two of them have a minor rapport. But she doesn't even try to understand his science ghost stuff. She seems to think it's all a fake. He seems a little upset about that, and that'd probably be a problem if they ever tried dating. So, to me, it's gotta be either Frank Hardy or Joe Hardy. And I'll be honest, at first, it took me a long time to tell the difference between the two Hardy Boys. One has a vest and the other's blonde. That's basically the main difference between them. Personality-wise, they're really similar. They both make jokes and they're generic helpful. Frank is slightly more serious while Joe is slightly more silly, but they're both fun, smart guys. I could see Nancy dating either one of them. The official pairing is Nancy and Frank, and that was decided long before these games were made. I'm still not sure why that's the case. It's not like Joe would be a bad boyfriend for Nancy Drew. He and Nancy could have a fun time together. Frank and Nancy are both 18 years old, while Joe is a year younger. I guess that's part of the reason people prefer Nancy with Frank. They're the same age. Also, Frank is more serious and determined like Nancy is. If you were going to pair them just by personality, it would be serious Frank with serious Nancy, jokester Joe with jokester Bess, and George with, well, George would be there too. Is Frank Hardy a better boyfriend for Nancy Drew than Ned Nickerson? That is hard to say. Frank's a detective, like Nancy, well, that's a big plus. But Ned is also part of the detective group. He helps Nancy solve cases just as often as Frank does. In fact, I think Ned helps out Nancy more than Frank does. He's been a phone contact in way more games than Frank has. But it feels like Ned isn't as useful as the Hardy Boys, because Ned always stays home for the entire video game series. Frank and Joe show up in person in this game and Creature of Kapu Cave. Bess and George also showed up in person for a few games, but Ned, he's never there. We got to play as him for a bit in Alibi and Ashes, but other than that, he's just a glorified phone contact. I think that's why people are willing to pick Frank over Ned. Frank actually does something in the video games. Ned is a mostly optional phone call. If Ned didn't exist, Nancy's life in these games would not be all that different. Besides for giving hints, the main thing Ned does is warn Nancy to be careful. Sometimes this works well. It feels like he's a kind, considerate boyfriend. Other times it works badly. It feels like Ned is being controlling, telling Nancy what to do like he doesn't think she's capable of taking care of herself. He's telling her to not do interesting things. That's boring! I think that's part of the reason why some people dislike Ned as Nancy's boyfriend, causing them to prefer Nancy with Frank. I think Ned is fine myself. I used to joke that I hate him because I want to date Nancy Drew. I don't mind having Ned as a character. If the book series had gotten rid of him at the same time they got rid of the Hardy Boys' girlfriends, I wouldn't have minded too much either. I can basically take him or leave him. For this game at least, Frank is better than Ned. I will pick Nancy Drew with Frank Hardy. Frank Hardy. This might be a surprise to some people, but I'm going with Frank Hardy and George Fane. George has an open crush on Frank in this game. She thinks he's cute and he cooks. What a great combination! You guys should come to our wedding! She makes a joke about that. She jokes that she wants to marry Frank because he's so amazing. Frank and George are both the smart, computer-savvy member of their respective detective groups, and realistically speaking, I think Frank and George is way more likely because Frank and Nancy is never going to happen thanks to Ned. Joe Hardy. I don't think Frank would work well with Laurie Gerard because Frank is serious and intellectual, but Joe would work with Laurie. I think it's indicated Joe has a crush on her. I don't think he's attracted to her because she's rich and famous. Those things don't seem to matter to Joe. I think he only likes her because she's gorgeous. That's kind of shallow of him. Yeah, he's kind of shallow. I would be interested in seeing how a Joe-Laurie relationship plays out because, well, they're both kind of shallow. She's a culprit. She only turns evil at the end of the game. She wasn't evil all along. I think Joe would have a positive influence on her. Maybe he would be such a good influence that she would renounce her evil ways. Of course, Laurie doesn't show any interest in Joe. I think that would change if he was the one who found her. Laurie would have given Joe that list of clues, and he would have insisted on them solving the puzzles together. Or at least he would have forced her to help him solve all the puzzles in the caboose. That could be amusing. Laurie, my feet don't fit in these ballet slippers. You're gonna have to help me out here. Ew, those dolls are scary, Joe. Get rid of them. In the end, Joe and Laurie would find Abraham Lincoln's letter together, and she would have been less likely to kill him to get the letter. She might still try to kill him, depending on how their relationship went, but I'd like to think she would show at least some hesitation before killing her boyfriend. But sadly, she would probably steal all the credit for finding the letter, and she would steal that along with Joe's heart. So I like Joe Hardy with Laurie Gerard, where he prevents her from becoming a villain. If that's not possible, then Joe Hardy and cheeseburgers. Tino Balducci. Oh, Tino. He's so full of himself, it's hilarious. Especially because he's not that good. He arrested some bad guys through pure luck, and suddenly he thinks he's the greatest cop ever. I don't think he would date anyone unless they constantly flattered him. Really, Laurie is the only option. She's probably the only one who wouldn't mind saying nice things about Tino all day. I love your eyebrows. I love your eyes. Did I mention your eyebrows? They're awesome. The two of them used to date, and they're still hung up on each other. I genuinely like the subplot of getting Tino and Laurie back together. Yes, they're both horrible people in their own way, but it's sweet how happy they make each other. I'm glad he learned not to care so much about what other people think of him. That was a lesson he needed to learn. Even if Laurie's not the best teacher, I would not be surprised if they were still dating after the end of the game. Tino would probably overlook her attempted murder, the same way everybody overlooks Tino pulling the emergency brake. So yeah, Tino can have his ex-girlfriend back. Let's let these two losers find love. And Laurie Gerard, same thing for her. She belonged with Tino. I know I said Joe and Laurie would be a good possibility, but Laurie and Tino just seems way more likely to me. She's still interested in Tino and so grateful when they get back together. That might not be true love, but this is probably as close as either one of them will get. Charlena Purcell. This is a hard one because she's mildly surly and ignores everyone in favor of her work. The most she does is get into a fight with Laurie when no one's looking. She stole Laurie's idea for a romance novel and is completely unapologetic about it. That's not the kind of behavior that screams passionate romance, you know? It's ironic that the romance novelist is so unemotional and unromantic. I said Charlena with Mr. Drew in the last video. That's probably still a good option. John Gray. I originally paired him with Charlena, but he can't stand her work. He says, Charlena Purcell writes romance novels. End of comment. John and Charlena are equally serious about their work and somewhat isolated from the rest of the group. It's hard to imagine him in a romantic situation. He's just so locked into ghost hunting science stuff. It's hard to imagine him anywhere else. So I'm going to go with Savannah Woodham, the other science ghost hunter. Someone suggested Abby from Message in a Haunted Mansion, and that would be interesting as well. Yeah, he could visit the mansion and figure out all the tricks behind the hauntings, and she would get mad at him. It would be an interesting story. Fatima, she loves saltwater taffy and romance. I don't want to stereotype her based on her accent, but I'm going to go with Pa from Trill the Twister. They both enjoy being addressed by one name, and they have arcade games about settlers in their general store, which doubles as a historical museum. That is very specific. Their jobs are basically the same. To summarize, Nancy Drew with Frank Hardy, Frank Hardy with George Fane, Joe Hardy with Laurie Gerard are cheeseburgers, Tino Balducci with Laurie Gerard with Tino Balducci, Charlena Purcell with Carson Drew, John Gray with Savannah Woodham, Fatima with Pa. What does the internet say? Nancy Drew with Frank Hardy and none/other. I wish none and other were separate options, because then I'd know, well, do people prefer her with Ned, or do they just not want her dating anyone in this game? in the same way Frank Hardy with Nancy and none/other. In both cases, Nancy with Frank got 12% more of the vote than none/other. Joe Hardy with Laurie Gerard and Nancy as a close second there. Cheeseburgers was the clear winner of Joe's second poll. Tino Balducci with Laurie Gerard and none. Laurie Gerard with Tino and none. So it sounds like Tino-Laurie is a preferred ship. Charlena Purcell with Tino Balducci and Fatima. I would read either one of those romantic fanfics. Fatima with Tino Balducci and Charlena Purcell. John Gray with Tino Balducci and none. Tino got paired with all the suspects, and Fatima, who's not really a suspect, I'm sure Tino is glad to hear he gets to date everyone he wants. That's it for Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon. It sounds like Tino and Laurie are the big couple of the game, which makes sense because they can date each other in this game. The next biggest couple is Nancy and Frank, and then Tino with everybody else.